Hello and welcome. This lecture is on behaviour management and how this can be applied in English lessons. Firstly, we're going to look at the language of discipline and how we can effectively use this positive discipline language in our classrooms. So, an introduction to positive language of discipline. And I must preface here that all of the concepts and ideas and strategies in this lecture have been developed by Bill Rogers and can be read in all of his books, but in particular his book, A Whole School Approach, Behaviour Management. So an introduction to language of discipline. Much of behaviour management involves language, and language usage is influenced by tone and timing and postural cues. So there are many things that contribute to language in behaviour management. Therefore, language is made up of verbal, so the spoken, but also non-verbal cues as well. Now, sometimes our language will need to be firm and using a commanding tone. But it's very vital when we use this firm and commanding tone that we respond in a very clear and controlled manner. And most behaviour management should be based on the philosophy of least to most intrusive. And least to most intrusive will allow the greater flow of a lesson, positive use of discipline language, and a more effective flow of the lesson. We'll look at this principle in more detail in a minute. So some key ideas or key principles in behaviour management. Firstly, the teacher needs to focus on the behaviour and not attack the individual student. So focus on the behaviour rather than attacking the student. The teacher should be brief when addressing the behaviour, and it's important to calm yourself, because if you are calm in the way that you use language of behaviour management, then you are going to have a calming response on the student. You need to provide take-up time where possible. We'll look at this strategy in a minute, but it essentially is providing students time to respond to your directional cue. We need to balance corrections with encouragement, and we need to be thinking about re-establishing working relationships. So after we've corrected a student, we need to find an opportunity to encourage them and re-establish a working relationship. And then we need to concentrate on the primary behaviour and the primary rules rather than the secondary behaviour. So for example, a student might say something inappropriate and might say it in a whining tone. So the primary behaviour is the inappropriate comment, and that's the thing that you would address, but you would ignore the secondary behaviour, the whining tone. So let's have a look at Bill Rogers' theory of least to most intrusive behaviour management. So you can see on the left, we are wanting to use the least intrusive methods of behaviour management first and primarily. This should constitute the large majority of your behaviour management in a classroom. And this is where you're using key strategies of remind, direct and question. So some examples would be tactical ignoring. And tactical ignoring is where we don't address the behaviour, but we just continue on with the flow of lesson. Non-verbal messages, so that might be a visual cue. Descriptive cueing, so giving a clear instruction as to what the student should be doing. Direct or indirect questions that are clearly establishing what the student should be doing. Conditional directions, so telling students what the condition will be if they don't follow the directions. Directed choices, so you can either work here or you can work next to me. Distraction and diversion, so moving on rather than being distracted by a comment or calling out by a student. And then directing students aside, that's taking them aside and addressing them individually. So these are the least intrusive methods. Then we move to slightly more intrusive. This is where we might redirect students. So we might repeat a command, we might refocus and redirect a student. We would always avoid arguing with the student, and we'd give out as much take-up time as possible. Then we would clarify consequences. So the consequence might be immediate. So Jack, if you don't focus on your work now, I'm going to have to move you into timeout. or it might be deferred. So, Jack, you need to focus on your work now, and at morning tea you need to come in and finish the work that you haven't completed. And then we need to establish consequences. So there needs to be cool-off time for the students, and then they need to be able to re-establish a relationship, a positive relationship with you as a teacher. So remember, we're trying to focus on the primary behaviour. We want to avoid arguing and ignore the secondary behaviour, and we want to convey the expectation that students are going to cooperate and allow them time to respond in a cooperative way. So let's go through some of these least intrusive techniques in a bit more detail. So firstly, we have descriptive cueing, and this is where we briefly describe the distracting behaviour to the student to raise their awareness. Sometimes students may not even understand or know that they are participating in a distracting behaviour. So for example, you might say, "Jess, you're fiddling with your pencil case and it's really distracting." So here you've said Jess's name first so that you've pointed the direction to her, so you've got her attention. You've then described the behaviour, so you've described that she's fiddling with her pencil case, and then you've cued that it's a distracting behaviour. And this puts the responsibility and ownership back on the student. Another technique is direct to behaviour. So this is where you're giving directional language to cue the student. So for example, "Okay, Year 4, sit up, use your working voices, and put your hands on your head and look this way." So we're focusing here on the desired behaviour rather than the rule-breaking behaviour. So we're focusing on sit up rather than stop slumping on the floor. Or we're focusing on use your inside voices or use your working voices rather than don't yell. And we're focusing on the correct behaviour, put your hands on your head and look this way, rather than the rule-breaking behaviour, stop calling out. So we're rephrasing the negatives in a positive way, and we're directing to the desired behaviour rather than the rule-breaking behaviour. So for example, you might say, "Listen everybody," as a positive description of the behaviour, rather than "don't talk while I'm talking," and that's a negative rule-breaking behaviour. The next technique is reminding, and this can have a very positive and corrective function. So during the establishment phase at the beginning of the year, reminders about rules and routines are very important, and so you'll use reminding a lot in the establishment phase of the year. So for example, you might say, "We have a rule about asking questions, use it thanks," or "Remember our rule about working noise, thanks." Always end on a positive note by saying thanks. Privately understood signals. Now these could be non-verbal signals, and they're best practice for least to most intrusive behaviour management. And you'll find that there will be particular students that you might need to use these non-verbal signals with in a private manner. So they could be explained to the whole class, or they could be just explained to individual students who are struggling with a particular behaviour. And they are a positive means of communicating, and they reduce the corrective language required. So for example, you could extend a thumb and the first 3 fingers in a downward motion, and that would indicate all 4 on the floor. And so this is telling the students to put all their 4 chair legs onto the floor. And originally you might pair the action with the words, so you might say all 4 on the floor, thanks, at the same time as extending the thumb and 3 fingers down. But then as time goes on, you take away the verbal cue and you just use the non-verbal cue of the hand signal. Another example would be extending hand upwards to reminding those who are calling out to raise their hand. Again, initially you might pair this with a descriptive cue. So you might say, "We raise our hand when we want to speak," while having your hand in the air also. And then as time goes on, you would take away the verbal cue and just raise your hand in the air to indicate to students that they need to raise their hand when they want to speak. Another example might be using the forefinger and thumb in a closed motion and then pointing to one's mouth to remind to speak more quietly. So again, at the beginning you would pair this with a verbal cue also, and you might say, "Speaking quietly, thanks," at the same time as using the closing motion of your hand and pointing to your mouth. And then as time goes on, you drop the verbal cue and you just use the non-verbal cue, the action, to indicate the direction that you want the student to take. Then we have tactical pause, and this is used when when teachers want to initiate and sustain attention. And so to initiate attention, particularly to a group, the teacher would raise their voice briefly, then they would pause, and then they would give the necessary direction in a lowered tone. So the pause conveys the expectations that the students will focus, listen, and respond. So for example, the teacher might say in a louder tone, "Listening everybody," then pause, then lower their voice tone. Now we're going to move on to the next step, which is writing down adjectives and adverbs for the sentence. For individual students, you might need to use their name first if they're not facing towards you. So David, pause. Facing this way and listening, thanks. You've said David's name to gain their attention. You've paused, given them take-up time, expecting them to initiate and respond and listen. And then you've given the instruction, facing this way and listening, thanks. So the name alerts the student. A pause provides opportunity for focus on the teacher. Then we have tactical ignoring. And this is a conscious decision to ignore a certain behaviour in order to keep the focus and flow of the lesson. Or you might acknowledge and reinforce a positive behaviour. It's a difficult skill because you might be feeling a sense of frustration towards the disobedient student behaviour. And it's different to blind ignorance, and it's only inappropriate when students are not being too disruptive. But as soon as they're very disrupting the lesson and really interrupting the flow of the lesson, then tactical ignoring can no longer be used. So, for an example, you might say, we're about to move into reading groups, and a student calls out, "Reading is for wimps." And the teacher responds, "Jack, could you please get out the reading books?" The teacher has diverted the attention of the class, refocused, and has tactically ignored the comment, "Reading is for wimps." Or a student whining out, "I'm bored, I hate this lesson." And the teacher responds, "When you speak in a normal voice, I'll be ready to listen." So the teacher has tactically ignored and redirected, "When you speak in a normal voice, then I'll listen." Or a student calling out in a lesson, the teacher might say, "When you raise your hand, then I'll come over to help you." Then finally we have redirecting. And this is when students might argue or procrastinate unreasonably, and it's not useful in this situation to argue or to defend what you think is correct. Instead, you calmly and clearly repeat the same direction, instruction, reminder, and question. And this is repeated in directional blocks this repetition will provide a directional block for the procrastination. And the student who refuses to respond to the read might need further redirection and reminder. And here the purpose is to communicate, "I'm not engaging with your disruptive behaviour now, we're going to talk about it later." Now we're going to look at some key considerations that will be useful when you are trying to implement positive behaviour management in your classroom. So firstly is the concept of take-up time. And this is the time that the teacher gives the students to respond to a corrective discipline. And it includes the idea of face-saving, cooperation, expectation, and trust. So you're trying to provide the opportunity for face-saving, cooperation, expectation, and trust. And non-verbal cues can be included, such as looking directly at a student and then resuming the flow of the lesson. Or you might have a verbal cue, such as, "Ben, lower your voice and cross your legs, thanks." And then give Ben time to take up the instruction without pouncing straight away and repeating with frustration, "Ben, hurry up, I'm waiting for you to cross your legs." Instead, you need to give the command, "Ben, lower your voice and cross your legs, thanks." Pause and provide Ben with some take-up time to respond. Second consideration is I statements, and these can be used to convey the teacher's needs and the concerns to the students. They can also be very effective for tuning into the students' needs and concerns. So some examples might be, Beck, I can see that you're upset. Is the work too hard? Or, Tim, I feel frustrated that you're trying to fix the problem with Jack by arguing. Remember our class rule, respect one another. Or, I want you to go back to your literacy group and work in a focused way. The next consideration is questioning. Now, the open interrogative why is a very counterproductive behaviour management technique. And you might have heard some of these used before. Why are you out of your seat? Why are you calling out now? Why haven't you started working? Why don't you do what you're meant to be doing? This interrogative why is not particularly helpful because students don't always know why they behave the way they do. And the interrogation calls attention to the secondary behaviour rather than directing to correcting the behaviour. If the teacher is snappy or sarcastic or hostile, the student's response is likely to mirror this. So if you respond in a very snappy or hostile way, such as, why are you out of your seat? The student is quite likely to mirror this. Directed questions are far more effective as challenging the student to take ownership of the behaviour. And this is what we want students to do, to remember that they have a choice of their behaviour and to take ownership of what they do. So for example, you could say, Sean, what's the rule about the way we speak to others? Here you're directing to the positive behaviour, you're not focusing on the secondary behaviour, and you're asking students to take ownership of their actions and their speaking. Then we have re-establishment of working relationships. It's very important after redirecting students to correct behaviour to then seek an opportunity to later re-establish a working relationship. So an example might be, Lisa has called out in class and you might say, Lisa, remember to raise your hand before speaking. And then a few minutes later, Lisa raises her hand to contribute and you might say, Lisa, I like the way that you're raising your hand so I know that you have something to say. So you can see the teacher has found a way to re-establish the working relationship. Now when children are younger, it's good to do this in a very public way. Students like feeling publicly praised. But as students get a little bit older, sometimes it can be more effective to be more private in the way you re-establish this working relationship. And so you might find an opportunity just to stand nearby the student and in a lowered tone say, thank you so much for raising your hand. I can see now when you have something to say. Then we have finally the choice of discipline. Now, for students to own their own behaviour, sometimes giving choices is a very reasonable management and discipline option. Now, of course, these choices are not completely free because they occur within the rules and rights and responsibilities and consequences given by the teacher. So it's autonomy-orientated limits. So the teacher pressure is minimal, and so students have real choices about how they're going to behave. And it limits the consequences for overstepping in a very clear way. So we're giving the students behavioural choices to allow them to self-direct their own behaviour. And the teacher needs to clarify the student's responsibility to make up their own mind. And this element of choice will depend on the tone and manner of the teacher's language, body language, and the take-up time, consequences, and re-establishment of working relationships. So for example, you might be saying, Ben, that's a cool tech deck you've got there. I'd like you to put it in your bag or put it on my desk, and then provide with take-up time. So instead of yelling in an anxious way, Ben, stop playing with your tech deck, where you're focusing on the negative behaviour, instead you're providing language of choice. Ben, that's a cool tech deck you've got there. I'd like you to put it in your bag or put it on my desk. You're providing Ben with the choice to choose how to correct his behaviour. Or another example, Jess, we have 10 minutes of writing left. I'd like you to stop talking to Becky and finish off your writing task, or move to the quiet desk so that you can finish your writing there. And again, the teacher gives take-up time. So here we're directing Jess to focus on her writing, and to correct that behaviour, we're giving her the choice of how she's going to do it. Is she going to do it at her desk by stopping talking to her classmate Becky, or is she going to move to a quiet desk? And you need to provide the student with take-up time in order to respond. Now, there needs to be consequences to disruptive behaviour, but we might have direct consequences or we might use deferred consequences. Either way, though, it's very important that we follow up on these consequences to show that there is a direct link between behaviour and the consequence for that behaviour. So a direct consequence is if a highly distracting student needs to be refocused in the moment, and that would require a direct consequence. And it can be helpful to have a place in the classroom where a distracting student can be directed to work. So a quiet corner, an isolated desk, a quiet zone, or a timeout zone. For example, a student isn't focusing and is pulling faces. The teacher could move the student to work in the quiet corner on their own. And if the student chooses not to work for the next few minutes, even though they're in the quiet corner, the teacher could add, "If you choose not to work over there, you're choosing to stay back at recess." So you can see here there's a direct consequence to the behaviour, but then there's an implied deferred consequence that the student will have to stay back at recess if they don't choose to correct their behaviour. Now, for direct consequences, you might need to use relocation. So if a student doesn't respond to a least intrusive correction, for example, "Ben, quiet now and writing please," so a directive cue, then it won't help to threaten or cajole or shout at the student. Instead, you need to clarify the consequence to the student calmly and clearly and decisively. So for example, "If you choose to be off task during this literacy group, then I'll have to ask you to work in timeout for 10 minutes. And if the student still refuses, the teacher would reinforce, "If you do not choose your work now, you're choosing to do it at recess." If the student continues and refuses, the teacher can assume that the task avoidance has now moved to attention-seeking behaviour. So sometimes you can redirect the student by giving them a directional choice. You can focus on your work in your group, or you can come and sit beside me and complete your work. And if the student chooses to work, then a re-establishment of the relationship is necessary. So you might respond, "I'm so glad you've made a responsible choice and are working well now." But if the student refuses the directional choice, then the teacher will have to clarify the consequences. Now, deferred consequences are when we delay the consequence because in the moment of the teaching scenario, it isn't possible to carry through with the consequence there and then. However, all disrespectful and inappropriate behaviour must be followed up. So deferred consequences acknowledge to the student that the teacher knows that the behaviour has occurred and that there will be a consequence to their behaviour, but it won't be occurring immediately. These would apply to our students in the following examples: packing up materials in their own time, cleaning up in their own time, completing classwork or in catch-up time, a time trade consequence where a student engages in a negotiated time trade to do some positive thing. But whether it's a direct or deferred consequence, it's important for students to know that you will follow up on their behaviour that requires correction. So let's look at whole class direction and 3 main techniques that we can use when we are directing a whole class. The first one is giving commands. So in situations of high movement or active collaboration, where students might be moving from one task to a next or packing up, there can be a sense of chaos that might even become a bit dangerous to the students. And so what you need to do is gain the students' attention quickly, and this will require you to raise your voice, but you only raise your voice just to initially gain the attention of students. So you might call out, "Oi!" or you might call a particular student's name, "Peter." Then you give a command accompanied by a physical signal, "Over there," and point to the corner of the classroom. This sharp command provides immediate direction and removes the student from the chaos or danger. So, for example, in a classroom, you might call the attention of the students by saying, "Stop, look, listen," or "Focus everybody," or 3, 2, 1, or "Stop." And then the command following might be, "Move away now, put that down." And this is when we're delivering in a very unambiguous, commanding and assertive tone. Now, this To reinforce, this is when we're giving command in a situation of high movement where it's getting to a little bit of point of chaos and there might be some sense of danger. We're trying to get the immediate attention of the student and then provide a sharp command that will give direction to the student. However, in these situations, the teacher should never screech or convey panic, and the tone should always be assertive and avoid hostility or aggression. Then we have whole class directions and reminders. So when we're directing and reminding the whole class of expected behaviours, it's important to be brief and clear. We don't want whole class reminders of behaviour to take up the whole lesson. We want them just to be brief and clear. So firstly, avoid talking over noise. Students aren't listening, particularly in crossover activities. Don't speak over the top of students and try and expect them to respond to your instructions. Have a workable age-related attention-getting signal for the group. Pause, scan to gain the eye contact of students. That will give you an opportunity to gain the sense of the student take-up time. And then remind the students of the class rule. So, for example, you might call out 3, 2, 1, pause and scan the class and wait to get eye contact of all the students. Then you might remind the students of the rule. Before we begin, let's remember our rule, hands up without calling out. And then the teacher reminds the students during the lesson with a brief direction, hands out without calling out, thanks. Then finally we have talking out of turn, and this occurs during whole class teaching. And it's very important to deal positively with this behaviour by reinforcing rules and behaviours that are expected in class for asking questions or contributing to discussions. So when a student calls out, the teacher could firstly use tactical ignoring and then use a rule descriptor. A number of students are calling out, please remember our class rule and raise your hands before speaking, thanks. So they've tactically ignored the students that are performing the disruptive behaviour and then giving a rule descriptive. Please remember our class rule to raise your hands before speaking, thanks. For a particular student, you might say, Jason, you're calling out and clicking your fingers. Please remember our class rule, thanks. Or you might give a direction, hands up without clicking fingers, thanks. If several students are waiting to speak, it might be helpful to acknowledge them for waiting. Dean and Peter, I can see your hands up. I'll be with you in a moment. So what type of behaviour management strategies would we use in group work? And this is particularly applicable if you are doing literacy or maths rotations. So in the establishment phase, you need to gain the group's attention. And this is a critical time in the lesson where you're wanting the whole group to be paying attention. And this might be at the beginning of a lesson for whole class teaching, or it might be when students are moving between rotations for group work, a crossover activity, or it could be for packing up at the end of the group work rotations. And it's important for having a routine for gaining the whole class attention that doesn't require you yelling out in a loud voice. So some teachers will use non-verbal cues, such as walking into the centre front of the room and raising their arm to indicate attention. Other teachers might use a bell or a clapping rhythm, or sing a song, or even strum on the guitar. The students need to understand that the teacher is communicating. Face this way and listen. The tone and the manner and the confident expression and use of pause and scan will communicate the message to students. And if students are engaged in on-task group work, then the teacher needs to provide an initiating cue. For example, pens down, look this way and listen. The teacher needs to consider the congruence of directional language with non-verbal signals, such as pausing, take up time, and a positive voice. You need to stand with a confident body stance and provide enough time acknowledging students to settle. Then we can praise the students who have responded correctly. Jane, I love it how you've put your pen down and turned to me. This redirects the students to the directional command. Then we have taking distracting students aside. So during on-task phase of a lesson, it can be helpful to correct some students more privately. And this is particularly helpful for attention-seeking students. We take them aside privately, and that's far more effective than correcting them in front of an audience of peers. For an example, a student is coming in late and the teacher says, "Morning, Pete, take a seat, thanks," and then refocuses on the lesson. The teacher will speak to Pete later about why he is late. Or another example, a student calls out, "We've already done this, we did it last year." The teacher doesn't engage with the student but tactically ignores and responds, "Would anyone like to share what they have learnt from last year?" And then the teacher will follow up with that disruptive student later in a private manner. Then we have finally the directing from across the room or at a distance. So particularly in group work, we might be directing from across the room. And so if a student is beckoning across the room, we need to communicate expectations. For example, during group works, two girls are unsettled and the teacher might say, "Bryony and Jess, I'd like to see you over here in a moment." The teacher holds the eye focus for a moment, provides take-up time, ignores any secondary behaviours such as sighing or groaning from the students and resumes working with the group, but then waits for Bryony and Jess to come. This technique avoids unnecessary tension. So 3 tricks for group work. You might need to be thinking about the establishment phase for gaining group attention. Then think about how you're going to take distracting students aside in a private manner. And then thirdly, directing from across the room or at a distance. Whenever we're seeking behaviour management techniques, we're always wanting to aim for use of positive language, because positive language of discipline, although it may not come naturally, it allows emotional responses to infiltrate the classroom in a positive way. And when we communicate in the language of discipline, it's important that we communicate in a calm and clear way and give effective directions. Now, you might find it helpful to write down some directions or rule reminders, some questions, some choices, assertive statements, and redirecting dialogue in preparation for your lessons. Sometimes if you've written these down and thought them through first, they might come more naturally in the classroom. So, for example, some positive language cues, some directions might be, "Pens down, looking this way, thanks," versus negative language cue, "Don't call out, stop talking." Or another assertive statement could be, "All 4 on the floor," versus the negative language, "Stop rocking on your chair." Or another rule reminder, "Sitting up, thanks," versus "Stop rolling around and slumping on the floor." And if you practice, you can build this positive language of discipline and management into your classroom. In whole class teaching time, we want to use language of discipline that is brief and less disruptive, because we want to reclaim the lesson quickly. In the on-task phase of the lesson, we can afford to be more discursive with discipline, because here there's an opportunity for private discussion. But remember, the least to most intrusive language, corrective language, is the best for building positive relationships with students. So to finish with, we're going to apply some of these strategies to an English lesson. And I've got 2 scenarios here. And you can see in the second one, there is a much better use of positive corrective behaviour management techniques. So this is scenario number 1. It was the beginning of the morning literacy session, and Mrs. Jones was already feeling defeated. "Hurry up, get moving. Jack, stop talking. Penny, hand out the books. Come on, everybody, we're in a rush." Mrs. Jones was anxious to get started, and they had a lot to get through. After 10 minutes, the students were settled in their seat and Mrs. Jones started teaching. "Okay, today we're looking at narratives. Ben, stop tapping your foot on the floor. It's really annoying." Ben calls out, "We've done narratives 1,000,000 times, miss." Mrs. Jones storms over to Ben and yells, "I don't care if you've done them 1,000,000 times, Ben. You haven't got them right now, and we have a test in 3 weeks' time for narratives, so you better pay attention." After the class has discussed what language features are in narratives, the students begin the on-task phase of writing, where they'll construct an orientation of a narrative. 4 girls are giggling up the back, and Mrs. Jones calls from her desk, Girls, you need to stop giggling. Girls, why aren't you writing?" Then she noticed that Tim doesn't have his literacy book and is rocking on his chair. "Tim, why don't you have your book? Stop rocking on your chair. If you don't start working, I don't know what I'm going to do with you." So you can see in the establishment phase at the beginning of the lesson, Mrs. Jones doesn't have the attention of the whole class to begin with, and she's speaking in a panicked and anxious tone. She's not providing take-up time when she tells students to rush. A tactical pause could have allowed Mrs. Jones to gain the attention of the class, drop her voice, and then give clear instructions in a calm manner. Directive behaviour would have been effective here. Year 5, pens down, eyes to me, thanks. She should have given clear instructions and used rule reminders. Then in the whole class teaching time, Mrs. Jones could have used tactical ignoring for Ben's foot tapping. Alternatively, she could have used descriptive cueing. Ben, you're tapping your foot and it's becoming distracting. She doesn't acknowledge or correct Ben's calling out behaviour. Mrs. Jones probably should have reminded him by responding, Ben, we have a rule about calling out. Use it, please. And by storming across the room, Mrs. Jones has lost the lesson flow. She's disrupted her teaching and drawn attention to the incorrect behaviour. She could have used a redirection to bypass Ben's response. Then finally, in the on-task phase, Mrs. Jones could have been moving about the room monitoring the behaviour more closely. Physical proximity to the giggling girls probably would have settled them down, and then it wouldn't have disrupted the rest of the class. Alternatively, the choice of language could have been a bit more strategic. Girls, you can choose to focus on your work, or you can choose to work separately on a different table. And then asking Tim the proverbial why, rather than a directional question, wasn't so helpful. So instead, she could have asked him, Tim, what could you do to start your work? And for Tim's rocking behaviour, perhaps a less intrusive directional command could have been helpful. Tim, all four on the floor, even using a hand signal to accompany. So let's look at this scenario reworked to use positive behaviour management strategies. It was the beginning of the morning literacy session, and Mrs. Jones was looking forward to a productive lesson. 3, 2, 1. Pens down and eyes to me. We're about to move into our literacy lesson, so can you quickly put away your maths book and get out your writing book? Then she adds, Jack, I love how you're already ready with your book open and pen down. Thanks. After 1 minute, the students are settled and ready to start. Okay, today we're looking at narratives. Ben is tapping his foot, but Mrs. Jones tactically ignores it. After some discussion about narratives, Ben calls out, We've done narratives 1,000,000 times, miss. Mrs. Jones diverts her gaze away from Ben and asks the class, What can you tell me about narratives that you learnt last year? Ben returns to tapping his foot, and Mrs. Jones says calmly, Ben, you're tapping your foot and it's becoming distracting. After they have discussed what language features are in a narrative, the students begin the on-task phase of the writing, where they construct an orientation of the narrative. 4 girls are giggling up the back, and Mrs. Jones moved to stand behind the girls. 2 girls stop giggling at once. Then she says quietly to the other 2, Girls, you can choose to focus on your work here, or you can move to work on another desk. She then noticed that Tim doesn't have his literacy book and is rocking on his chair. She moves over to Tim and says, Tim, get out your book, and gives a hand signal with 3 fingers and thumb pointing down to indicate all 4 on the floor. So here in the establishing phase at the beginning of the lesson, Mrs. Jones commands the attention of the class using 3, 2, 1. She gives a tactical pause and then gives direct instructions. She then gives take-up time to allow a response, and she positively praises Jack as a reminder to the other students of what they should be doing. Then in the whole class teaching time, she uses tactical ignoring for Ben's foot tapping. Then later, when he persists, she uses descriptive cueing. Ben, you're tapping your foot and it's becoming distracting. And then when Ben calls out, Mrs. Jones tactically ignores it and uses distraction and diversion with a question to the class. What can you tell me about narratives that you have learnt this year? Then in the on-task phase, she uses the least to most intrusive. She moves to the girls first before saying anything at all. Then she uses choice language in a private manner. Girls, you can choose to focus on your work or you can choose to work separately on a different table. Then she directionally cues Tim. Tim, get out your book, and begins the command with his name to get his attention. Then for Tim's rocking behaviour, she uses a hand signal and a less distractive private cue. I hope this lecture has given you some very practical techniques for managing challenging behaviours in English lessons. And the main references for this lecture are Bill Rogers' text.